All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another week of an amazing negative space panel. Um, Not a lot of announcements today. Just kidding. We have an awesome competition that just opened up, and another one that just closed. If you all were following along, our pitch competition just closed a few days ago, and super excited. It's actually one of our most popular competitions we've had. Everyone seems very excited to pitch. More information on that is coming your way soon, so you can sign up for that event. You can listen to people pitch and learn a lot more about what it's like to pitch your story. And then our Spaces competition, which is open to diverse and underrepresented creators, opened up this week. We have Alex Segura announced so far as a mentor, which is super awesome that he's coming back to mentor. He was amazing last year. And that one's open for almost 2 months now. So you have some time. Regular deadline closes in a month, and then the final deadline in about 2 months from now. So um, I know we have no other events lined up just yet for panels, but we'll get some of those announced in the next week or so that we don't lose this rhythm of awesome panels every 2 weeks. It's been so amazing, and that's mostly due to Josh Sippie. Thank you, Josh, as always. Amazing work getting panelists that clearly our audience wants to see because our numbers just keep going up, up, and up. And can't thank you enough for that. So I'll leave you to it. Enjoy your time. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And we'll see you in a few weeks. For me, enjoy the show.
Thank you, Noel. So one thing I'll say before we get started is make sure you ask questions. We have that Q&A button down on your dashboard. Don't be shy. Ask all the questions you have. I normally get to them all. There are exceptions, but if you ask questions that are relevant to the current conversation, I'll get to it right away. If not, I will save it to the end. Also, if you've missed any interviews that we've done, you can find them all on the Negative Space YouTube channel or on any major podcasting platform, the Negative Space Comics Podcast. So enough of that. Today, we're talking with Ryan Inzana. Ryan is an illustrator, concept designer, and animator whose work has appeared in various media all over the world. Ryan's comics have been inducted into the Library of Congress's permanent collection of art and have earned an Eisner nomination, as well as an Asian American Pacific Islander Honor Award for YA literature. Ryan, hello. Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
So we're going to start where we always do, which is I want to get sort of your creative origin story. What made you want to start telling stories in the first place?
So probably like almost every other person out there that's trying to pursue comics, I just read a whole lot of comics when I was a kid, and spent a lot of time in the comic book store. I know it's not too many of those left, but it was like one of my favorite places to hang out and just discover stuff. And I had a few friends that also were into comics, and we just share stuff. And when you see it, it gives you the impression that possibly this is a path for a career. Although that didn't seem like a definite thing either. But just seeing it and loving it, and then trying to do it and drawing my own little comics when I was, coming up. So yeah, that's basically the impetus.
Gotcha. And were you, I'm always curious when you're an illustrator and the writer, which came first for you? Were you writing before you were illustrating or other way around?
Yeah, it was definitely the illustrating.
Hmm.
And even though, I write, but I am way less secure in my writing than I am in my drawing, which is why I started, when I first started like trying to do longer form comics, I would um, I would write out these really long scripts, and then I'm going back and I'm thumbnailing them, and it was never as good as what I saw in my head, and it's harder. It was harder for me to pitch them because I'm using all these words that I'm not going to have, in the comic. I have a scene, and it's more of a sell when I can just, show you what I'm talking about. So I started. I think it was before Ichiro. I started, fooling around on my own, actually just drawing and writing at the same time. And for me, and every person is obviously different, but for me, it was a lot easier, and the storytelling got better, I think, because I was able to just shave off a lot of extraneous nonsense that I'd be jotting down on those pages that wasn't helping me. wasn't out there.
And were you like, because with the growth of an artist, obviously when you start, you're kind of feeling your way around. When did you start to really, pursue doing this as a profession, and what sort of steps did you take to improve your craft? Did you go to school for this specifically?
So, after high school, I knew I wanted to do something with art. I applied to a bunch of art schools, and I got into Pratt with a few other ones. And, from there, like, because I grew up in West Trenton in New Jersey, and we didn't have an art program hardly. It was, kind of bare bones. And like most of the kids I knew that went to my high school, it was more like just trying to keep the kids from destroying too many things in the art classroom rather than actually trying to teach us. Like, I think I learned perspective in high school. That was maybe the extent of my artistic knowledge, but I would try stuff on myself, and I would, get books and, before, things were all over the internet. So I would just try to find any way possible to learn anything, and just, basically like copying, X-Men books, and like, how everyone learns when they're a kid, you see stuff you like and you try to emulate it. But at some point I figured out how to make a portfolio, went to Pratt, and that's where I really learned, art is, there's a lot more to it than what I thought. So, yeah.
And I'm always curious, whatever side of the artistic writer or artist that you fall on, when you sort of got the sense that you were actually pretty good at what you were doing. Because I know, like, especially with writers and artists in general, there's so many insecurities. There's always that sort of imposter syndrome. Did you struggle with that at all, or was it something where you, like, especially getting into Pratt, I imagine that had to do a lot for you to realize, like, this is definitely something I can do with my life.
Yeah, but I got there and everybody else was so good because they all went to art high schools and they had tutors and whatnot. And I was like an idiot. I would go in there and I had like raw drawing skills, and that was basically it. And, so I very much was struggling. Like the first year, I felt like I was underwater. I just had, to learn everything from scratch. And, to be honest, like you always feel like there's tons of great artists out there. I never try to get like, oh, I'm doing something that's so great, I could just sit back and relax. Because I think that's the way you find yourself out of work. I always try to keep, pushing it. And besides the fact, if you keep striving to improve yourself, you're still learning. And it's probably the only interesting thing really about choosing this profession, because it's a hard, road to walk in life. But if you like to learn and you want to keep improving your skills, you can keep, always be getting better and better, which is great. I don't know, you probably top off at being like the best CPA or something. There's like a level you get to, and then like you can't get any better. Whereas an artist, the sky's the limit. So I think I chose right. But yeah, totally.
And transitioning from Pratt out into the real world, so to say, was it a pretty seamless transition finding work once you had that degree to your name?
Absolutely not. I started out, and part of it was just my own idiocy, because I interned at Marvel Comics for years, and I was still like, I don't think I was ready to like, become a penciler on any title by the time I graduated from college. But I could color, and they offered me work at the bullpen, which was really awesome. But I turned it down because I thought if I get locked into an art job, then I'm not. And this is only like something that a 21-year-old would think. Like I'm locking myself into this. Like meanwhile, I have no idea how I'm going to earn a living. I just did like part-time, jobs here and there, and then freelance. But I turned all that down, and then went out into the world to try to figure out how to freelance. And what I did is I basically, at that time, I was really looking at political illustrators, political type comics. So I started like, trying to figure out, call people, like if I could get a number to somebody or if I could get an email to someone, just emailing people and like, look, I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to become an illustrator. I want to become a comic artist. Can you give me any advice? And maybe 3 or 4 people in, I ran into Peter Cooper, who does Spy vs. Spy. And I mean, he's just a fantastic illustrator and a comic artist. And he was just transitioning his to get a new assistant. And I spoke to him for like an hour, like asking him questions. And he said, like, you came on a really good day. He's like, because I am looking for an assistant. I was like, well, I'm looking for somebody to teach you what the hell I'm doing. So yeah, so he then I assisted him, like, basically, his art style is cutting stencils, which is crazy. So I cut stencils for years, and I did inking and some background painting. But I learned how to be a comic artist. I learned how to be an illustrator, and I was introduced into like a whole world of underground New York comic artists that were all awesome and really cool. And, it's probably the reason, I'm sitting here talking to you, because I was able to reach out when I was young and find these people. Yeah.
So it was essentially like a version of cold calling, just going out there and being like, here I am. And it worked out for you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing with getting illustration gigs. Like, you have to go out and just putting stuff on Instagram is not enough. You have to make that connection with people. And yeah, it's the same thing with trying to figure out your way in this art world. I think that's the way.
Yeah, and that's a good segue, because I was going to ask you, you have a lot of stuff out there, and we often hear, especially when you're getting started, get your work out there, get short comics out there, get something out there so you can point people to it. Were you trying to do that? Was that something you were actively trying to do? And what were your sort of, because you've got a very diverse portfolio now, where you've been in magazines and working with all kinds of different clients. So how did you sort of find your way into that side of the illustration world?
So, I mean, I wanted to do everything, because I saw other illustrators, like, they weren't just doing one thing. They were doing, the ones that I really admired had their, hands in like all sorts of different things. So I didn't want to just be like, well, that guy, I started wanting to do political illustration, but I was like, it's really limiting. And political illustration gets really depressing after a while. And it gets kind of like monotonous, because the same things are in the news kind of forever. The same political problems exist now that they did in the 80s and before that. And so I wanted to expand what I was doing, just to be more interested in what I was doing. But when I first started out, I was like going to small papers, which don't exist anymore, but Village Voice type things. And I got a comic in something called New York Waste, which was a punk rock magazine. I did comics for them for years. And then I got involved with World War III Illustrated, which, it's a bunch of, political artists all doing comics. It's one of the longest running zines out there. And yeah, that was basically it. It was just getting pieces here and there, and then building and then cold calling, going on portfolio reviews, which that doesn't happen anymore. You go to a building and hopefully get to meet with the art director, or you just drop off your portfolio and pray. And then they call you back and say they don't want anything to do with you. But yeah, so that's how I did it. And it's like, it doesn't happen overnight. It is, you're building upon each thing and trying to get to a higher level.
And those steps that you were taking then with sort of getting your work out there, were those things that you feel like added up to getting you to where you are now? Like, we'll talk about Ichiro in a second, but were those things that heightened your exposure and allowed you to get to that stage of your career?
Yeah, I mean, it allows you to make a living. So like, I wouldn't have to be, take a side job or anything. Eventually, you have enough clients that if you do good work, you maintain those clients and get more clients. But it's arduous. There's, it's just a very long, it's not like you just walk out of school. Of all the very few people that I went to school with are illustrators. In fact, almost none. He didn't go to school with me, but he went to school across town. The only person I know who actually did do that, or 2 people. or James Jean did it. He just stepped out right into DC and they hired him. But that's one person out of I don't know how many years, like of Pratt and SVA that of kids that just went out of school and they're like, boom, they're doing covers over at DC. Uh, that doesn't happen. Most other people, they're trying to find the way. So yeah, that's how I did it.
Mm-hmm. I lost my train of thought. I had a great follow up to that, and now I lost it. But we're gonna switch a little bit and talk about the different approaches that you take. Oh, I remember what I was gonna ask you. I was gonna ask you, one of the things that I really admired about your portfolio is how versatile your art seems to be. Like we often talk about branding on this show and how you brand yourself as an artist and developing your own style. And I really admire how yours, like it seems to fit sort of the vessel that it's sent to. Like what you've done for Wired looks different than what you've done for Politico. And I'm wondering, like, whenever you work those gigs, I assume they give you parameters to work inside, and sort of how you bring yourself to those kinds of projects. Like what of your own style are you allowed to bring to something like that?
Well, you'd be surprised how much leeway they give you.
Mm,
I've never been someone who thinks that you have to live and die by style because I think
mm,
it's the easiest thing that anyone could replicate. People don't pay me for how I draw. It should be uh, go without saying that you can draw and you can paint, and you can do all these things. They pay you for your ideas,
mm,
so they're paying me for what I come up with. Like if you just want a portrait of somebody, that looks really cool, I don't know if you call me. I want to do something, and I don't know if I'd
mm,
be that interested because you want to have fun with it,
mm,
and just drawing a picture of somebody without putting yourself in there uh, is not that interesting a thing for me. So even when I work with game publishers and whatnot, they have they want you to go to town, but they're paying you
mm,
for your idea. And I have fun trying to find the right. My styles all have like it's not like crazy different styles, but they go off in different ways because I'm trying to solve a problem.
mm.
And if I can use style in a way to solve that problem, then that's taking some of the heavy lifting off of me. We're going to talk about Ichiro, but I spend a lot of time doing brushwork and practicing with the Japanese calligraphy brushes um, because I'm trying to tell a story and I wanted the style to help tell that story. So if you can use style as a way to communicate, you're doing some of the heavy lifting without even having to do anything other than uh, draw your story.
Sure. And then I'm curious if you buy into that notion of you have to have a brand as an artist, you have to, or as a writer or an artist. Do you feel like you have to go out there and sort of establish what you are good at, what you do, and sort of build from there?
I don't know because it might be different nowadays because I'm coming at it from someone who's been doing this a little while, and I wasn't Instagram was not a thing when I came into this profession, but just having if the work is good and they're going to look at your portfolio, they're going to take a look at pieces. Again, I think it all comes down to branding is one thing. I guess people could say, well, this is this guy, but you look at a lot of artists, and I'm like, well, this guy looks like this other guy, and they all look the same to me sometimes. And it's like, if is that really going to differentiate yourself from the rest of the people in this art world? So I don't know. Branding is, I think people maybe put a little too much into that. I think you could still have a really good career without, trying too hard at that.
I agree for the record. I just like to hear what other people say about branding.
Yeah.
And one last question before we get to Ichiro. You've both illustrated your own work, and you also, for Strange Rain, you correct me if I'm wrong, you illustrated another person's script. What was that process like with adapting someone else's words into your art, or what like did the I assume the script came first, and you maybe saw something you liked in it and decided to work on it?
Yeah. I do, quite a bit of comics for, magazines I've done before um, uh, well, I've done a whole bunch of stuff that was with a script and another author, and it's sometimes they give you leeway where they're like, well, we understand this is not this is your medium. You could change the script, you could, edit it, you could add things. I do a lot of stuff for a Swedish magazine. It's a food magazine called Fool, and they'll have like a chef, and like they give me a very loose story. And this one story was about he was a French chef who moved to a small island off of Japan, and he he had like started this winery, and they gave me like a loose script to it. I completely went off their script, and I found this one aspect, like there were tanuki that lived in the mountains around his house, the raccoon dogs, and he mentioned like kind of as like a side note that like he grows grapes because he has a vineyard, and that the tanuki were like stealing the grapes, and I just like completely went off on that. And I made this whole other storyline where these tanuki are like stealing these grapes, and like his family is in terror, and I draw them like so like I think the guy was like shocked and appalled, but it was so much fun doing it, and everyone loved it except maybe him, which I never heard from him. But it really made the comic for me, and I obviously the publisher liked it because they hired me back. But so it varies. Sometimes they want exactly what's on the page, and it's very formal, and it gets kind of crazy. But yeah, it varies the way, but it's always a script, and then I'll work off that and give them thumbnails, and then go through the process just like an illustration, basically. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about Ichiro, which, in case we couldn't tell, is one of my favorite graphic novels. So when did the sort of inspiration take? Because this, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the long form. Was this your debut long form graphic novel?
So my first book I did when I first got out of school, Johnny Jihad, which that was a long time ago. I don't even think it's still in print. But I was, I guess, 21 when I did that, and yeah, that was from MBM, small publishing house. They're right there in New York City. But this was a much longer book. I think that was like 96 pages, and this is like way more than that. I don't remember how many pages it is. But what I learned doing Johnny Jihad, definitely came into play when I decided to do a longer format comic. And I wasn't rushing to do another graphic novel just because it's really hard. And, just doing illustration and whatnot, pretty much takes up all the time. And I don't have, even weekends you're doing work. And then it's like, well, when am I going to be doing these comic pages? But you find the time, which I did. And it's because I had a story that I really wanted to tell. And I guess the genesis of it was my now wife, she's Japanese, and I went with her to Japan basically to get approval from her parents because we were going to get married. And we went, they're from Hiroshima, and we went to the Peace Museum in Hiroshima City. And it's something that like disturbed me so much that I felt like I don't understand like how this can happen. Even though we all know the story, we all understand it, from what we've read or what we've seen on TV. It's when you see the actual, museum, you see the history, and you read the stories. It's so deep and affecting. And knowing that her own family, survived the bombing, and hearing their stories, and it made me really think about this deeply. And I also thought about my own family. My great grandfather, my grandfather served in the Pacific in a ship fighting the Japanese, and my wife's family, fought for the Japanese army. And it's like, and then a couple years, decades down the line, these two, countries that were at each other's throat, like people, their grandchildren are coming together, and it just made me ruminate on war and all these things. And so that was like the seed. And then my love of Japanese folklore, the yokai aspect of it. I've always been interested in that. I'm always interested in mythology, but especially, kind of that strange, like it's kind of like an underground mythology, the mythology of the yokai, because it's small like villages that have these explanations that becomes like a mythology in itself. And then those little small things like don't cover your belly button when it's thunderstorming out because Raging will come and steal your belly button. Now those things get co-opted into bigger religious themes like in Shintoism, but it all starts as explanations of how the world works. And I think it's really fascinating. The stories are, obviously really amazing too.
So it sounds like a story that has a lot of a mission behind it. You said you weren't in a hurry to write another graphic novel, but from this story, there were just a lot of factors that added up to making this the right story. Did you know what form it would take? Did you know it was going to be long form, or did you just kind of start absorbing things and then dive in and see where it went?
Yeah, I don't think even the publisher, I don't think they were expecting the book to be this long. And they were kind of saying after a while, it's like, I'm going way past deadline. And they're like, but they're seeing the book as it's progressing. And they know that I'm not just like sitting around and, goofing off. But the story just kept coming. And it's like, but I want to take it in this direction. I want to go with it. I want to understand this. And the amount of research I did, there was just too much information that I had. And I traveled all over Japan getting all this information, which is really fun and it definitely helped the book. But I had all this and I was just like, well, what do I cut out of it? And there's like tons of pages that I did wind up cutting out just because, I'm sitting with the editor and I'm like, we don't have to cut this out, but at the same time, we should just start, focusing in and boiling it down and making it more cohesive. So I just had way too much to say, and I tried to fit it all in, but sometimes you got to edit yourself.
I want to get back to a lot of what you said about publishing it and about working with an editor, but I first want to rewind a little bit to, whenever you started working on this, did this project feel different than other ones you'd worked on before, or was it sort of business as usual for you?
Well, I mean, when I do a graphic novel and it's just such an amount of work, especially the writing I find so difficult that I really have to want to say something because I could just do art, with the illustration work I always do and get art out there. But if I want to do something that's really personal, that's where I find comics, are an outlet, so I can say something that I want. I don't, want to devote like a year of my life to, just doing some nonsense. Although I have, and it's, it becomes a job. Whereas writing Ichiro was, it just kept coming. I've done long format comics that I didn't write and are not fun. And, it's just, they are what they are. Yeah, so that's kind of how it unraveled.
And then, this was sold as YA. And I'm curious if you had intended to write it for younger audiences, like, was that something you thought to do starting out? And was this your first time doing that?
I don't even really think of that stuff. I mean, because I mean, they want you to think of that. When you pitch a book, they definitely want you to think about that. And they want you to think, well, what other books can we compare to this book? And I'm like, I have no idea. But I was very lucky. I hadn't read it, but American Born Chinese had come out like a year or so before. And my editor said, have you read this? And I said, no, what's it about? And she said, it's about mythology. It's about Chinese mythology. You should use this as a compare book when you're pitching. I was like, yeah, well, let me read it first because I have no idea, but it was a great book, obviously. But I think Ichiro is nothing like that book, but because it has something to do with Asian mythology, the publishers are often like they got the blinders on, like, oh, well, that's sold, so this will sell. Even though, like, I mean, they couldn't be more different in what they're going about, but they need to see that what you're doing could possibly sell something, so I think that did help.
Sure. And I want to rewind a bit again, because you mentioned that you had an editor at this point, and I'm curious, at what point this book sold and what you had to sell it. Like, did you pitch it places, or was this something that was already sort of sold on concept and then you built it from there?
So much earlier, I had pitched them an autobio book of Hemingway,
Mm.
which they really wanted to publish. And because of the Hemingway Foundation, they thought that they were going to be sued. I've since talked to a whole bunch of different Hemingway scholars, and they're like, they're crazy. You would never be sued for this. But I mean, like, you know, they will, they didn't want to risk it. But they had my work, and I showed them samples, and I had a pretty developed pitch for that. So, time goes by, and they said, if you ever have anything else you want to pitch, please come see us. So when I came up with my concept for Ichiro, I think I went to a couple of different publishers. Some of them, I think, a few publishers were interested, but they wanted to see a whole lot of extra like pages, and like basically they wanted to see the whole book. I'm like, well, this is kind of what you're paying me to do. I don't have time to develop this whole thing. And why I went with Houghton Mifflin is because they were willing to put a little faith, and like, okay, we know you did, we like what you did before, and we think you could probably, do it again with us. So I was fortunate. I was fortunate enough.
Were you agented? Was that an agented submission, or was this a connection? Because the reason I ask is Houghton Mifflin Harcourt is it's on the traditional publishing side of things. So was that a connection you had previously, or was it through an agented submission?
No, I didn't have an agent. I knew a designer there who gave me the name of an art director who gave me the name of an editor. And basically, all you need is names, and you can basically track these people down. And don't get me wrong, they get a lot of submissions, but they are also actively looking for work. This stuff doesn't manifest by itself. So, I mean, if you are aware of editors or publishers or certain people working within these things, and that they're amenable to graphic novels and comics, what's the harm in cold calling them or shooting them an email? Be respectful, be brief, but you lose nothing in trying to engage with these people in a respectful way. So.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you what that introduction, because that's such a daunting process for writers to sort of just go out there and be like, you don't know me, but I've got this project that you might like. What was your process whenever you did that? Did you just introduce yourself, or did you just throw the project at him and say, here's what I'm working with. Do you like it?
Well, if one person, like a designer, and then this other, you can use names to kind of get up the scale. So that definitely did help. Mm-hmm. But and when I first got published at MBM, it was because Cooper had done a book with them. So I mean, but these are relationships that I sought out. Like, you have friends that you go to art school with, or you are comic friends of yours that are trying to do the same thing. Stay in touch with them. You're stronger together than you are apart. Rest assured. So the person that is not doing much with their career now could be like the head editor at some comic house tomorrow. So and you could help them, and by the same way that you come up together and you try to help each other to do what you want to do.
And was this sort of the first time you had taken this out to market? Or had you tried pursuing other paths, like going the self-publishing route or going through a traditional comics publisher? And what made you decide on Houghton Mifflin Harcourt? Was that sort of like, did they make an offer that made sense to you?
I just wasn't seeing like a smaller publisher doing a book of this size. I think I did pitch it to Dark Horse. And again, some people over there liked it, but they need a lot more than a few people thinking it's good. They need a lot of faith over there, and plus it's a hard sell. When you hear Ichiro, without seeing the book in front of you, you're like, maybe that could work. Some things sound like a short elevator pitch, and it's like, oh yeah, that's an amazing idea. And Ichiro is like a very convoluted book in many ways. I'll confess to that. And it's a hard, like, short pitch. So I did try to pitch it to some traditional comic publishers, but I always thought like, well, I guess it could be a series, but then they always came back to me and be like, well, you have to hook people in like each issue. And are you going to be able to do that? And I had to honestly answer like, well, I would definitely try to do that. But yeah, it's like, I didn't conceive it that way. So it's like, that's not what it is. I had to try to go with a bigger publisher because I know they do those books.
Mm-hmm.
So like, you also got to know what you're going to do, what you want to do. And then, what that publisher does. And if it does something that, along those lines.
Mm-hmm. And I want to get into the I'm kind of going backwards here. I want to get into the crafting of Ichiro, but I also, now that we're talking about the publishing side of it, I want to stay here for a second. So, the book sells to Pot and Mifflin Harcourt, and you had mentioned the editorial process. So I wanted to get back to that. With having to cut stuff and with how, big the book was it hard for you to acclimate to having, an editor really weighing in on the process that much?
Well, I worked on, the other books I worked on, the editor was very hands off. And to be honest, when you have a really big book, to have a good editor, to do any book, a good editor is, worth their weight in gold. Because even you could say, well, you can have a friend read it, you could, do all those things. You're not going to get the kind of advice with someone who does this for a living, who's able to really get in there and say, well, this is not as strong as this, and to have someone who you agree with. My editor was great, and she really helped me, and she helped me, go through the process and shepherd it, and that's what a good editor does. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So now I want to get into sort of the actual crafting of the story itself. We're going to start with a question from the audience, which is when you're both writing and illustrating a project, how does your writing style influence your art style and or vice versa?
So with Ichiro, I think I actually started out just writing it, and then I switched to doing the thumbnails along with the writing. So the first thing I did was like a general overview of the entire project, and then broke it down into bolted chapters. So some of what when I first started writing, I was very descriptive. Everything that I was going to draw, I wrote out like darkened room, camera angle from this perspective. It's like writing storyboards. And then I got to the thing, I was like, why am I writing all this? I'll just draw it. And then it started to flow. And I stopped, I had so much more dialogue when I was actually typing it and before I was like drawing, and all that dialogue went right out the window. I was like, I don't need all this stuff. I really started to pare things down. So it definitely influenced that. And once you have one panel, like you're drawing a page, right? So you might see it on, when you're writing it. How does this scene unfold? You're dealing with panels. You're dealing with all sorts of other things. When you're writing that, at least to me, maybe people have some some sort of symbiosis of these two skills. I do not. I need to see that page, in front of me, and I can move it around, and then I can really determine how the art is going to go, because a lot of it is just like I can just tell you all that stage direction, but I don't really know if it works until I get it on the page. So,
and then for Ichiro specifically, was this a story that I'm always like curious with how much you outline in advance and how much you kind of just fly by the seat of your pants and see where it goes? Is this a story that you knew like start to finish what was going to happen, or were you kind of exploring along the way?
there was some exploration, that's for sure. But I mean, they wanted a pretty comprehensive outline. It did take some twists and turns, and like it really got pretty, big in between like what I thought it was going to be and the finished product. But I had a pretty comprehensive outline. I did not know exactly what was going to happen at the end, and I might have cut the original ending, and which I don't even remember what it was. but I definitely think, the ending that I decided on was much better, and the editor agreed. Ending a book is hard, and if you could come up with that first, they always say come up with the ending first. Very hard to do. So yeah, but I did have a pretty comprehensive, um, you know, overview of the whole book.
Sure. And one of the things that I admire a lot about it is how there are a lot of prevalent themes in each. I feel like that the hard thing about themes is you want them, but you don't want them to be that noticeable. So you don't want people to feel like being preached to or whatever. And
Right.
all the themes in each, I feel like we're so well balanced. So I'm always want to know, like, do you actively engage with themes, or do they kind of just naturally work their way into the story?
Well, there are definitely things I want to say, but
Mm-hmm.
you're absolutely spot on. I don't want to hit you over the head with it. I try not to, and
Mm-hmm.
it's really easy to do. But there are definitely things I want to say, and some of it is just like once the story is rolling, these things just kind of uh, flesh themselves out. I mean, if you have once things are really moving, and you have your story, you have that direction. There are going to be themes that just come in there naturally, and then like some of the stuff is not even as clear to me when I'm putting it in there, and it all meshes at the end. And that's like kind of the cleanup work, trying to get all those things to lay down properly. But yeah, I do think about a lot of that stuff as I'm going through it, and try not to be too heavy-handed with it.
You mentioned that you had something to say with the story. Is that sort of how the story began? Some people begin with a character that they want to build a story around. Some people begin with a setting. What was it for you that sort of sprouted Ichiro? Was there a certain entry point, a certain story element that served as that entry point?
It was probably a combination of things.
Mm-hmm.
One was obviously what I spoke about with the Peace Museum. The other was the Iraq War, which was still going on at the time. I mean, pretty much still going on now, and Afghanistan. And it's all those things. These different themes that are going around in my head, and trying to make sense of it, and also use the structure of mythology and the story. Uh, Things just kind of like you know, I just kind of started playing with things, different aspects of it, and then it started to be a cohesive piece. But yeah.
And there are a lot of, speaking to the artistic choices you made, there's a lot of stylistic things that were really neat, like the way you switch the art style whenever it goes in the mythological setting. You had mentioned in the ending of the story how you would use the no theater mask as sort of the inspiration there. And even having things like the speech bubbles switching from white to yellow at different places, like these are like extra mile elements, I feel like, that sort of show a deeper depth to the story. I'm wondering if you plan those out as well, or if those are things that you sort of realize you can do along the way, and like, oh, I should add this, and it adds another cool element to it.
A lot of that stuff I planned out from
Mm-hmm.
the get-go, just because I've seen different aspects of that in like some of the great comic artists that I admire. And then when you're doing a comic, you're like, well, I can incorporate that too.
Mm-hmm.
I have my own reasoning for it, but it's just an expansive knowledge of what other people have done, is, really helpful when you're sitting there trying to think of stuff for yourself. But yeah, I mean, all like, trying to change the color of the balloons and everything. All that, I think, how can I communicate better is what I always
Mm-hmm.
question, because that is your goal. You need to communicate things, and you don't want to go on for 4,000 pages. You have to try to do it as concisely as possible, and that's what I tried to do with all that.
I like that. How can I communicate better? That's good. I like that. And then just a more generic question here, but the creation process is long. There's a lot you're going through. Is there anything unexpected along the way that either worked its way into the story, or that kind of caught you off guard about the story, or anything along that journey that was unexpected?
I think the way that I chose to do the sections of full color, um, I know they weren't even really on board for that to begin with. I had to do some production technical aspects, but it's something I thought was really important. But it wasn't in my main pitch, like because everything you do a book, you just assume, well, they'll figure a way to do it, but it costs money to do things, and you can't just say, well, why don't we do this? No, they don't. That's not the way they play. So, to come back and say, well, we need like a certain set of full color pages at this point was like kind of a heavy lift. But I was like, I think it's crucial to the story, and I think it'll be worth it. How can we figure out a way to do it? And we had to separate, chapters, and we had to space the pages to make it affordable enough to do. So it wasn't something that I was like, this will be color. I had to have it spaced exactly in like, specific set of pages so that they can make it into the book. So that was something on the fly that we kind of decided, yeah, let's do it. So.
And that brings up another question I meant to ask whenever we were talking about the editorial process, but I think there's another element to that where there are times where I think a writer has to, stand their ground on certain story elements. Did you ever have to do that where an editor said, this part can't stay, and to you it was integral to the story? Did that ever happen to you?
On Ichiro, I think we pretty much were on the same page. I'm trying to think of other books. I do remember having these conversations, so I know it's happened to me before. It's definitely happened to me with illustration before. But some of it you have to know, like, is this worth like fighting a huge battle over it? It really has to be something integral. If there's any doubt in your head, you can't just like constantly be putting your flag in the sand over every little thing. When you do a book for a publisher, if you're doing for self-published, that's great. But there's going to be back and forth, and you have to be open to that. You can't just say my way or the highway. That's not how this world works.
And I'm curious if you ever have like creative, like I don't want to call it writer's block because you do illustration work too, a creative block, especially when you're on a deadline. Do you ever run into that, and how do you overcome it?
Yeah, I have a creative block, and it usually happens when I have zero time to have this block. So yeah, I'll be like, I'll have something due, the next day, and I'm like, I have no idea, what this sketch should be, or what, if I go out and take a bike ride, sometimes that helps. Sometimes I'll just, I'll take out a big sheet of paper. I'll just do thumbnail after thumbnail after thumbnail. I'll just keep doing little sketch, like they don't even mean anything to anyone. If someone were to see them, be like, that doesn't even look like anything. But I'm working out the problem, because usually it's because I like an idea too much, and maybe the client didn't like it or what have you. And then once that is shot down, I'm like, well, I had nothing other than that. That was it. So you need to take, you basically just have to shut it off for a second and then rehash it over and over again and try to find that new way of looking into it, because that's where the answer lies.
Then we just got another question from the audience here. So you mentioned staying in touch with the people you come up with. Do you have any additional advice on how to build that network of contacts?
Well, the other thing that we talked about is just you got to go out and cold call people, and you have to try to engage with people that it's nerve-wracking, especially when you're young and you're starting out. You're like, cold calling someone is terrifying, and you automatically assume they're not going to want to talk to you. But I assure you, a lot of these people, they've been in your position, and they want to help people out too. And they're not all cynical and like mean or whatever. So reaching out to those people, and if you can get into if you have like you're into a certain type of comics, like how I got into World War III illustrated. I was into politics. I got together with a bunch of group of other political comic artists, and it was just like a really cool scene. And we do all help each other out when we have openings, and sometimes there'll be a book, and we all have comics and whatever book. And it's just really nice when there's other people that do what you do, and it's like it's like a family. It's a really great feeling. And now that I moved down to New York, I kind of miss it, because it's not the same when you live hours away. It's just a different scene. But to have that, especially when you're young, is really crucial. I think it's very helpful.
And then I also wanted to ask you about just the general concept of time management, especially when you have multiple projects going on at once. How do you keep yourself on schedule for projects, and how do you know when you're sort of at your limit?
Yeah, it's tough because I often go beyond that and I regret it. And then like my wife yells at me because I don't have any time on the weekend to do anything. But it is tough weighing it, especially because sometimes you'll say, "Oh, this project sounds good," and then it falls through, and or it gets delayed, and then it comes back around, and you don't really have a choice. These are higher paycheck levels than me, so making these decisions. So sometimes you don't even realize you're overbooking yourself. But I try to gauge, what is conceivable based on me doing this for a long time. And I beg everyone for extensions. When I get the project, the first thing is like, is this a hard deadline? Because almost 90% of the time, that's not the deadline. That's like some sort of just date they put out there. So like they know you're going to blow it. So they just put that out there. So trying to get to that actual deadline date, because it's probably at least a few days, it gives you a little breathing room. So that is helpful. But yeah, it's really hard. I can't lie, and I fall victim to overbooking sometimes, but it's better than having no work at all. So there's
And
that.
I was gonna ask you too, is especially for people that are getting started, I feel like the impulse is to say yes to anything, whatever offer you get, say yes to. Do you sort of have any advice to if that's a good policy to have, or how to know when a project is right for you?
Well, when you're starting out, it's really hard, especially like if you're depending on some of it as like actual income, so that you could pay rent and eat and do all those nice things. So like, I'd like to say like, just toss those, assignments to the side and be true to yourself and whatnot. But you might not have a choice. I mean, so I don't want to be so, high-minded like that. But uh, once you are in this for a while, obviously you can pick and choose a little. But I couldn't pick and choose when I was starting out. I had to pay rent, and I didn't have too many other options. So I took what I could get, and I did everything as best I could. But the key to it, I think, is take a bad assignment and try to make it a good assignment by doing it the way you want. And back in the day, the New York Times, one of they used to have an actual like the illustrators would be in the New York Times, and the editors would come out and they'd throw them like assignments, and they'd all be at drawing boards. And one of the illustrators who was part of this group called Inks told me he's like he worked at the New York Times back then. He said whenever they gave me some really horrible subject that was boring, I know I couldn't do anything with, I would just draw a monster. And I try to incorporate a monster into it and somehow make it fun for myself. And in making it fun for myself, a lot of times it came out to be a good illustration. So sometimes, like, you just have to find that avenue that makes a really boring, horrible job fun for you. And you're going to, level up your art by doing that anyway. So yeah.
I love that. We're just about out of time, but I want to add, you've given so much good advice already, but for people who want to make a living in this industry, either as a writer, artist, or a combination of the two, if you have one piece of advice to give those people, what would it be? It can even be something you've already said, but just is there any one specific thing that you think, stands above the rest in terms of that advice?
Uh, I mean, they hear. I'm sure everybody's heard this from everyone, but I mean, you really have to stick to your guns and stay with it. And it is even though it sounds like, oh yeah, I've heard that one. That is really the answer. And I know no one wants to, hear that. Like I've heard this before, but that's really the answer. It's always like it's like statistics. The longer you're in it, the more likely you are to succeed. And even though that sounds cliched, it's true. And if you really want to do this, you will do it, but you have to really sacrifice and you have to put yourself out there. And it's not just, being good. That goes without saying. You should be good because you should be doing it constantly. And, And if you stick with it, that is really the key. I wish there was another gem, but that's really the best one you can get.
No, it really is. And then last but not least, do you have anything to promote? Anything coming out? Anything coming up that we can look out for? And where can people find your stuff or you online?
Oh, so you can see my work at ryaninzana.com. And right now I am working on a bio book for Bruce Lee that is from Penguin Random House, and that will be out in 2024. I am not writing this. It's a very awesome author, Teresa Robeson. So I haven't seen, I just did the concept art on it. So we're at the very beginning stages, but it focuses mainly on Bruce Lee's, like the Kato years and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's going to be really cool. I am a huge Bruce Lee fan. And when they offered this to me, I was like, man, this sounds too good to be true. And I just, signed up right away. So I am really stoked about that. And yeah, so that's the next thing on the comic chopping block. But yes.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. You've given us so much good advice. We really appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
To all our listeners, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Negative Space Comics.com/events. We'll post it there and we'll see you then.